Kate Milifalcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Helen. Welcome to all my returning subscribers. A gigantic welcome to my new subscribers. Everybody, pause a second, check your buttons, make sure you're subscribed, and make sure you hit the little bell. And you want the little bell to be black, not personalized, black. And that will guarantee that you'll find out when I put something new out. And today I want to talk about an institution that is much maligned recently. And I thought it'd be interesting to go into the background of the UN and just see what we can see about it. I learned some things I didn't know. I'm embarrassed to say I didn't know this stuff. So the UN didn't just turn up overnight. There was about a century almost of people liking the idea of an international union of governments to maintain global peace. I think would explain it succinctly. And so there were a number of different organizations and stabs at it. Some worked, some didn't. So one of the very first was the International Red Cross, and they stepped in to provide medical aid and other kinds of emergency aid for people in places of war and conflict. Then there was the League of Nations, and this was Wilson's idea. Wilson, a very problematic president, in my opinion, huge racist. He tried to get the League of Nations together around the time of World War I. He got it approved after World War I. They had this Paris Peace Conference, and in 1920, in January of 1920, they signed the Covenant of the League of Nations, and it was ratified by 42 different countries. But by the time they got to the 1930s, it was completely ineffective. My glasses are so dirty, I'm sorry. Completely ineffective. Several different conflicts had occurred, and it didn't provide any relief. For example, Japan in Manchuria, Italy and Ethiopia. And then if you might recognize something about these countries, Japan, Italy, and other countries left the League of Nations. And in 1939, when war broke out, World War II, it effectively was disbanded. Then in 1941, June of 41, there was the International Allied Conference. They produced the Declaration of St. James Palace. This was the Allies, getting together. This led to the Atlantic Charter in 41. A couple months later, Roosevelt and Churchill got together and they defined their goals for a post-war world. They were thinking ahead of how things would be. They met in September of 1941 again, and signed a common principle of policy. 8 governments in exile from countries under Axis occupation signed it. USSR signed it. And the Free French, French had been occupied and divided. There was the Vichy government and there was the occupied government. And the Free French, I believe, were the resistance group, the official resistance group. Then they held the Arcadia Conference in December of 41. Once again, Roosevelt and Churchill. And that was when Roosevelt coined the term the United Nations. This was all of the Allied countries, allied by definition in World War II. Churchill agreed with the idea of the United Nations. It comes from a poem it can be found in a poem by Lord Byron from 1816, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, when the Allied forces went against Napoleon at Waterloo. The 29th of December of 41, they drafted the Declaration of the UN. It was signed by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Hopkins. As it was created, Hopkins was a trusted advisor for Roosevelt. Roosevelt insisted on a provision within this declaration that guaranteed that they would support religious freedom. Stalin agreed. Interesting. Roosevelt named what they called the four powers. This was the United States, the United Kingdom, the United Soviet Socialist Republic, and China. These were the top four guys, the top four big dogs in the United Nations when it first started. And the Declaration of the UN was signed on New Year's Day of 1942. It was signed by Roosevelt, Churchill, Litvinov, foreign minister for Russia, USSR, Soviet Union, and a guy called T.V. Soong, who was the Chinese premier. 22 more nations signed it the next day. To join and sign on to the United Nations, you had to sign and declare war on the Axis powers. So the idea of a post-war international organization was developed more in 43 at the Moscow Conference and, ironically enough, the Tehran Conference. In September to October of 44, they had a conference at Dumbarton Oaks, where the big four countries agreed on the aims of the UN, the structure of it, and the function of it. In February of 45, so several months later, Stalin was finally convinced to put aside his reservations, and he signed it as well. In March of 45, they got 21 more countries to sign on. In April of 45, in San Francisco, they had the UN Conference on International Organization. 50 governments and different nonprofit groups came. The Big Four chaired the conference. Churchill urged, including the French, because they had liberated the French after the liberation of Paris. Excuse me, they considered that they should let France join. And yes, so technically it became the Big Five. In June of 45, the Charter of the UN was officially signed by 50 countries and officially took hold, like became a real thing in October, a couple months later. It was ratified by all of the top 5 countries and a majority of 46 other nations. In 46, in January, they had their first meeting of the General Assembly. That's like the governing body, with 51 countries in attendance. It was held in London. And they then selected New York for the international headquarters of the UN. And by October of 52, it was finally built. The first elected UN Secretary General was somebody whose name I'm going to absolutely destroy, the Norwegian Foreign Minister Trygve Lie. Their primary mandate for the UN is peacekeeping. It's often paralyzed in its history by the United States and Russia being in the middle of a Cold War. And the UN would not intervene in that. Except in July of 1950, they okayed a U.S. coalition, a coalition led by the U.S. to repel North Koreans' invasion of South Korea. And 3 years later, in 1953, they signed the Korean armistice. It didn't really end the war, it just stopped the shooting. In November of 47, they signed Resolution 181. We all know what happened after this. They signed the partition of the British Mandate in Palestine into 2 states. They gave Jerusalem international status. This passed 33 to 10. 10 other countries abstained and 1 was absent. It was accepted by the Jewish representatives and rejected by the Palestinian and Arab states. And this led to a civil war in that area. In 48, there was the declaration of the State of Israel, and Arab armies then invaded Palestine, and that led to the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, which was brought to some sort of conclusion in 1950 by Ralph Bunche from the UN, who negotiated an armistice. In 56, the first UN peacekeeping forces were established to go to Suez because there was a crisis when the British, French, and Israelis invaded Egypt. Simultaneously, the USSR invaded Hungary, and the UN could not intervene because they didn't have the ability to intervene in two such faraway places at the same time. In 1960, they sent a UN military force to Congo, to restore the control by the Democratic Republic of Congo, which was achieved in 64. Dag Hammarskjöld, who was the then Secretary General, died in a crash on the way to meet with rebel leaders involved in that. He won the posthumous Nobel Peace Prize. That was still a controversial accident. In 64, U Thant was sent, he was the Secretary General, sent peacekeeping forces into Cyprus, and this became the UN's longest mission. And throughout the 60s, they were more and more, they had more and more membership to the UN as countries in Africa especially decolonized, became independent and joined the UN. In 71, Taiwan, the Republic of China, was replaced in the UN on the Security Council by the People's Republic of China, and the US was opposed to this. This was regarded as a real waning of US power and influence within the UN. Then there was what was called the Group of 77, what's called Third World Powers, led by Algeria. And they got together with the Soviet Union in 75 and declared, now these are their words. I want to make that really clear to YouTube. This is what happened in history in 1975. This coalition of countries declared Zionism racism. The United States and Israel both opposed that. It was repealed in December of 91 at the end of the Cold War when the USSR broke up. UN has failed a number of different mediations in the Middle East, in Vietnam, in Kashmir. I mean, there's just page after page after page of conflict, crisis, emergency, in threatened conflict that they have tried to get involved in and failed to bring about any kind of mediation. And I have an opinion about this. We're going to do some cards about this later, but in a separate video. UN goals shifted. They started out with the intention of keeping peace, global peace, but it became, after a couple of decades, their priority shifted to economic development and cultural exchange, and they cut their budget for peacekeeping. After the Cold War, peacekeeping went down, and they did more peacekeeping efforts in the first 5 years of the UN than they did in the last 4 decades. Between 1988 and 2000, their resolutions doubled, and their peacekeeping budget increased times 10. So where were they involved? I mean, there's just this list. It's incredible. El Salvador, Namibia, South Africa, Cambodia, Kuwait, and it just goes on and on. In the late 80s and 90s, they were accused of mismanagement and corruption. The Reagan administration withdrew money from UNESCO, which was a UN, I don't know what the word is, an ancillary portion of the UN. And this is the thing I didn't know. I didn't realize that there are some very famous organizations that are actually part of the UN. And I thought that they were independent. I didn't realize this. We're going to talk about that in a second. In 92 to 96, Boutros Ghali was the Secretary General, and he reformed some of the administrative governmental type organization of it and decreased the size of the Secretariat. Then Kofi Annan came in and he did even more to cut back the kind of the bureaucracy. In the 90s, they sent a mission to Somalia, and that failed because the U.S. withdrew. So united, it seems to be a very significant portion of the title. If they all stand together, they have more success. In Bosnia, the UN was indecisive in the face of ethnic cleansing, and we all know what happened there. In 94, the troops failed to intervene in genocide in Rwanda because the Security Council dithered. They had indecision. They didn't know what to do. In 2003, the UN's effectiveness was questioned when the U.S. just went into Iraq without even just sidestepped the UN. Under Secretary General number 8, Ban Ki-moon, the peacekeepers in Darfur, peacekeepers were sent to Darfur, Congo, Syria, and Sri Lanka. And there was just a systemic failure within the peacekeeping structure of the UN. In 2010, they lost 101 personnel in the Haiti earthquake. Terrible thing. From 2000, they had a Millennium Summit, and there was much discussion and focus on international development and economic development. They did talk about poverty, gender equality, and public health. But their progress was really uneven because the main focus was on the economics and the development. In 2016, there was a big public debate with the goal in mind of making the UN more transparent. The 9th Secretary General from Portugal, Antonio Guterres, he emphasized diplomacy to prevent conflict. Maybe we should think about peacekeeping again. In 2010, they partnered with the World Economic Forum to accelerate the 2030 agenda for sustainable development. And, they talked about climate change, but they talked about a lot about prosperity. They have had severe funding issues since 2020. In 2025, they were at a crisis because members were not paying any of their dues or even a full amount of their dues. And the U.S. came out and said they won't pay. They've paid a lot and they won't pay more than a quarter of their total peacekeeping fees if other people don't pay too. The U.S. and China delay payment whenever they feel like it to put pressure on the UN about issues. And as a result, created a big financial crisis for the UN. There were all kinds of cuts. Millions of lives were put at risk because of it. Why, you ask? Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. In January 2026, Guterres wrote to the members, sent them all a letter, and said that the UN is facing imminent financial collapse. So some aspects of the UN that I didn't realize were part of the UN. I just feel really dumb. The Hague, the World Court, the International Court of Justice. It's the primary judicial organ of the UN in The Hague. I thought it was an independent international group. It adjudicates disputes between nations and it advises on international law. Its main objective is non-interventionism in domestic issues, peacekeeping and security internationally, and protecting human rights. And the real important person involved in this, the International Court of Justice, was Eleanor Roosevelt. And I made a video about her not too long ago, and we talked about it there. She was instrumental in 1948 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which set a common standard. It's not legally binding, of course, but it is an expression of values that need to be centered. Over the years, the conventions have been held by the UN on the rights of women, children, the indigenous, the LGBTQ community internationally. They also have a hand in economic development and humanitarian assistance. For example, refugee camps. An organization that I didn't know was part of the UN, I feel really dumb here, is WHO, the World Health Organization. I thought it was an independent organization. It never occurred to me. The WHO is instrumental in taking the lead on global health concerns like polio, river blindness, leprosy. They also provide emergency relief that feeds over 90 million people in 80 different countries every year. They do environmental programs and they help with decolonization. So in the United States, the John Birch Society opposed the UN for fear of a loss of sovereignty. And I remember they were hot about this in the 60s and they got hotter in the 80s. Rand Paul has authored an American Sovereignty Restoration Act to withdraw from the UN, which it's been introduced a couple of times and he had it reintroduced in 2020. And with that being said, we're at the end of my presentation, and if I can find it, I want to read you the official hymn of the UN. And I had it all set up, and then of course, you know, phones, because I couldn't find my book. But this will just take 1 second. Everybody hang on here a second. So they wrote where did this go? They wrote a hymn to the UN. And the music was written and played by Pablo Casals, world famous cellist. Okay, here we go. For heaven's sake. Okay, it was a big New York Times. I know this is fascinating. Sorry. Okay, here we go. Hang on, everybody. I did have it here. Well, I guess I'll have to do a separate video. They do have it, but it's like 1 million different poems listed first. Okay, in memory of W.B. Yeats. I'll have to look at that. Okay, I will be doing a separate video on looking a little closer into this. And when we do that, I will have nailed down the words of Auden's poem. So thanks for being patient. Sorry about that. I hope you found this interesting. I learned a few things about the UN. So let's look forward to the day when a peacekeeping organization actually keeps the peace. Thanks for watching. Slán go fóill. Slán.